May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to thee, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy warplanes attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered World War II. President Roosevelt declared that it was a day that shall live in infamy. And almost immediately after, the slogan, "Remember December 7th" or "Remember Pearl Harbor" began to appear. But what is it that we are called to remember? The deaths of the innocent? The crimes of the guilty? And to what end? Do I remember in order to stoke some fire of rage, to refuse to forget in order to refuse to forgive? The cry that we must never forget continues into the present, where as an American I see the slogan on images of 9/11, but the sentiment is also much older. I'm a good enough American to know that I'm supposed to remember the Alamo, though truth be told, I'm not a good enough American to know what precisely I'm supposed to remember about it. Now, I open with these American events intentionally, because for many members of the university, an appeal to remember these events in particular smacks of a kind of narrow-minded nationalism. So does remembering the fallen soldiers come at the expense of forgetting the thousands of innocent deaths in their conflicts? Such questions are reflected then in my generation's increasing suspicion that Remembrance Day and all of its attendant pageantry is just a thin veneer covering nostalgia for the heyday of empire. So has the church merely tied herself to the dubious politics of jingoism? What really are we being asked to remember? And to address these questions, I would like to reflect for a few moments on some of the themes in our passage today about the raising of Lazarus. Our passage opens with Mary and Martha sending word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus is extremely ill. And Jesus delays in coming, and in the intervening time, Lazarus dies. But there's something troubling about this story. Jesus speaks with such supreme confidence about the outcome of divine glory and the inevitability of Lazarus' resurrection that the storytelling itself seems to paper over the agony of loss. So let us pause for a moment then with Mary and Martha, who speak so poignantly to Jesus from their grief. When Martha and Mary hear that Jesus is coming too late to save their brother, they go out separately to meet him, and each say to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now those words are at once both statements of profound faith and furious sorrow. Each woman believes wholeheartedly that Jesus could have healed her brother and rescued him from death, but because of his absence, because of his apparent indifference, their brother has died. When, as a chaplain, I have buried the young rather than the old, I find myself grasping for something to make sense of the tragedy. Faith offers us hope, but it does so at a terrible cost. We affirm that there is a God who loves us, but this also means that we affirm that this God has not intervened to stop the madness and the evil. And the apparent emptiness of divine absence echoes in those moments of premature loss. Here, then, we find the first point of contact for our time of remembrance. And the horrors of war only compound the force of our questions. Jesus' own confidence in the good outcome, his easy assurance that this has happened for God's glory, seem hollow in the face of the magnitude of such loss. In 1943, when the war in Europe was in full swing, the Allies decided to attack the German crude oil refinery in Ploiești, Romania. The Allies planned this as a surprise attack, striking the oil complex from a low altitude of 200 feet, flying 200 miles an hour. Now, Allied intelligence failed to discover that this target had been turned into a defensive fortress. And what's more, the Nazis intercepted American transmissions about the surprise attack. So when the airmen arrived, they were hit by an intense barrage of enemy aircraft or anti-aircraft fire from ring defenses with extremely high accuracy because of the bomber's low altitude. The Nazis flew hundreds of balloons trailing steel cables designed to tear the wings off the airplanes, and the smoke from the refinery fires meant that the crews were flying blind. The explosions from the bombs dropped from forward formations lit oil fires that scorched the following aircraft and lit damaged planes on fire while they were in the air. The crews of young men, usually between the ages of 18 and 25, were flying through sheets of hellish flame. And as soon as the unescorted bombers had completed their run, they were set upon by waiting Nazi fighters. 1 in 5 of the American airmen in that raid were killed, and many more were wounded. Only 33 of the 178 participating bombers were still fit to fly upon their return to base. And the number of airmen killed in this one attack is almost the exact number of current Oriel undergraduates. Now, that raid was supposed to halt the production of oil and shorten the war by up to 6 months, which was the justification for such high losses. Instead, the Nazis brought in 10,000 enslaved people and repaired the destroyed plant. And in a matter of weeks, they had it operating at a higher capacity than before the raid. The complete futility of the attack, at the cost of the lives of so many young men, some younger than you, only underscores the horror of death and the dissatisfaction of all our attempted justification. Those losses were real people, young men full of hope, love, and laughter. So with Martha and Mary, then, we remember them as we say, "Lord, if you had been here, they would not have died." But our passage does not end here. Jesus comes with Mary and Martha to the tomb of Lazarus, and he weeps. And this is a shocking contradiction in the story. Jesus, the Messiah of supreme confidence in his own power, is weeping over the dead who he is about to raise. The God of hope and the God of victory is also the man of sorrows. Following in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, God has ventured with his people into the wilderness, and so Jesus goes with his mourning friends to the mouth of the tomb. And here, it seems to me, is something equally important to the assurance of victory, the promise that God is with us in our sorrow and loss, that faith and hope do not rob us of our right to grieve. Our faith, whatever the costliness of our uncertainty, our doubts, or our fears, also affirms the immeasurable value and dignity of human life. In that sense, our faith underscores the horror of war. Not that war is never just, but that it is never good. I once conducted the funeral for a veteran who had been awarded a medal for heroism on the beaches of Normandy. Years later, after he had retired from a lengthy civilian career, one of the young men whom he had mentored brought him a vial of sand from the beaches, and some 60 years later, the man broke down and sobbed. And so with him, we remember the dead, and we remind ourselves, Jesus wept. But of course, the reason we're reading this passage at all today is because of Jesus' words of hope. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. This resurrection hope reaches beyond the grave towards something even more real, even more meaningful than life itself. And we see a kind of echo of this hope in the courage of the soldier who faces the possibility of death willingly, not because he or she desires to die, but because there is something greater over the horizon for which it is worth risking everything. When the Nazis interrogated downed airmen about why they fought, they frequently got answers like, "For Mom's apple pie," or "For the girls back home." Now, to the Nazis, these answers seemed to signal weak sentimentality or homesickness. But they missed the point. These answers indicated a belief in a world of the present and the future that was worth preserving, even if they were not there to enjoy it. Now, I am not naive. Not every conflict fought in the name of freedom has been necessary. Not every young person sent out to bleed to death in the mud needed to be sacrificed for our way of life. But we cannot allow our easy cynicism to dull our gratitude for the better world we have inherited. I'm almost afraid to ask, but what do we really see about our world that we would be willing to risk everything for? What people? What values? There are a great many things that we think are good, but are there any that we are willing to die for? Now, to ask these questions in light of this passage might at first seem to be deeply problematic. After all, does not Jesus himself allude to the final resurrection of the new heavens and the new earth? Aren't earthly visions of self-sacrifice too mundane, too tainted by politics or the ambitions or cruelties of men? But we must not forget how this story ends. Jesus approaches the tomb, breaches the seal, and calls out to his friend, "Lazarus, come out." And we see a resurrection, not to the eschatological kingdom, but to this life. Lazarus is raised into our world. Now, the implication is not, of course, that there is no final resurrection. Jesus explicitly affirms that expectation. But rather, the resurrection of Lazarus brings the sheer vitality of that eschatological vision and hope crashing back into our own existence. We live in a world that gives us a foretaste of both heaven and hell, joy and sorrow, life and death. It is incumbent upon us to seek out the good and strive against the evil for a better world, not in spite of our belief in the resurrection, but because of it. The men and women who have died in the service of our countries were not perfect, nor did they belong to a golden age. But we may still honor the dead, not by freezing their world in its place, but by always seeking a better version of it, as they have done. This sense of hope for this world, a vision of greater peace, joy, and life, is found in both the mystery of the Incarnation and the hope of the resurrection. May we thus remember them and honor them, but may we do so sharing in their hope for a better world. Amen.